All right, then. Welcome to the Cyber Insurance News and Information Podcast. I'm the executive editor of Cyber Insurance News, Martin Hinton, and welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking not about endpoints, but about incentives, silos, and why smart companies keep making the same risks with regard to cyber and cyber risk. To help us do that is Max Martina, president of Cambridge Leadership Associates. Max, welcome to the podcast.
Martin, what a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me on your show. I love this topic. It's definitely connected to leadership, and happy to get into it with you.
Wonderful, wonderful. What I love is words, and one of the things you do is you help with what are called complex adaptive problems. And the idea there is that these are problems that you don't have the existing tools to fix. That's the very Martin version of this. But we're going to move that conversation and that idea into the realm of cyber risk. And in that context, what Max does is talks to boards, C-suites about the evolving and real issue with cyber risk and how it's not like something they've been dealing with already. So Max, that's my take on it. Tell me a little bit about what it is you do and what Cambridge does.
Yeah, sure, Martin. That's great. So we were actually founded in the wake of 9/11 in 2001. And our founders, who are from Harvard alum and professors, had created this set of tools and frameworks that help individuals, teams, and organizations move forward in ways that encounter complexity, ambiguity, volatility, and uncertainty. I said that out of order, but known as VUCA in the US military. And so a lot of our work is about helping executives and organizations, including boards, navigate these complex challenges. Yeah.
So what makes, I looked it up after we spoke the first time. The adaptive nature of a problem this is the idea that we have to come up with a new way to deal with something. I mean,
Yeah.
is that too simple a way to think about it?
No, I think it's probably true. And so one of the things, maybe the way to frame this idea of a distinction of problems is the distinction between what we would call technical problems and adaptive problems. And so it's a really easy way to think about the nature and scope of problems. In a technical problem, which we often associate with expertise, right? Someone who has a skill or a trade or a specific know-how that can be applied to a problem that's very clearly defined, right? It sort of fits a box, even if it's a complex box, like heart surgery, for example. But on the other side of the coin, problems that we call adaptive are the ones that necessitate a change in human behavior. There is a requirement for maybe a new way of seeing the world. Maybe stakeholders have to accept risks or losses in different ways. And so in this way, these problems are often fundamentally very messy. In fact, many problems, we call them a mixture of technical and adaptive. And I think that, maybe a quick metaphor here would be if you're driving down the street and your tire gets a puncture, you don't need an adaptive leadership consultant, right? You don't need um, anyone, frankly, other than a technical expert. You need a mechanic with expertise in car maintenance and repair. But complex issues, right? Like think about global warming or international conflicts, as is current right now. These are complex, multi-layered, multi-scalar, often emotional issues. And so oftentimes we find that those problems are the source of interaction within enterprises.
Got it, got it. So now let's move into the specific realm of cyber and
Yeah.
despite how long we've been around and how long we've had the internet, it's a relatively new thing, and it's a relatively new reality for companies, particularly older companies. Legacy companies have had to adapt. I wonder
Yes.
whether you could take me into sort of this idea of why viewing the cyber risk as an IT or technical problem is a mistake that companies make.
Yeah, oh gosh, we see this a lot. I'm sure you see this too, but I think in most organizations, it's so much easier to think of an issue as a technical problem. And so in this world, cyber risk is definitely considered usually an IT problem, right? Internet technology driven problem with usually no clear executive level ownership, limited integration with broader enterprise risk, where security trade-offs are not explicit. And so, unfortunately, the problem is actually more adaptive, which is to say it's an issue that confronts most organizations that requires shared responsibility, a diffuse set of stakeholders. Um, I'll go off script here a little bit and talk a little bit about how this issue is really unique from a psychological lens. Um, in essence, it's a strange environment because here a success for cyber risk looks like nothing happening, right? But a failure has catastrophic consequences. So you have this inverse, this asymmetry of impacts and results. And what ends up happening in most organizations, particularly at the board level, is that asymmetry actually creates what I call work avoidance. So organizations actually avoid seeing this problem as adaptive, and it festers and typically gets worse in many cases. Unfortunately, I'm laughing, but I'm only laughing because the complexity of these issues is very high off. And I know the stakeholders in some of these organizations and companies just incredibly frustrated by the lack of perception around the real issues at the company cyber level. So it's real. Yeah.
I mean, so in that context, then, if you've got a cyber event or some kind of mistake involving a sort of
Yeah.
cybersecurity issue, it can be viewed through this lens as a leadership failure. Is that
Yes.
something that
Spot on, spot on. And I think it often doesn't. It is a leadership failure, right? Because those with positional authority, but also influence within the system, can't actually pull the right levers to create focus and engagement around the critical issues. And so, what often happens is what we would call an outcome bias in psychological terms. That just means that great, nothing's happened. That means we've been successful. But right, that you can have nothing happen and get very lucky, or have something happen and maybe have great cybersecurity measures that are highly effective in most cases, right? So yeah, definitely a leadership issue. And when I say leadership, I might add one more distinction here, that oftentimes when someone says leader, I have a little heartburn. We have this in our world. We have this really maybe confusing way of talking about leadership. So when I work with executives, I don't call anyone a leader. What most people refer to as a leader is someone with positional authority. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're practicing leadership. It doesn't mean that they're actually driving the real issues forward. So when I think about leadership in systems, particularly as it connects to and cybersecurity and risk, I think about who in the system is actually doing what's necessary to move forward, to create progress on these critical issues. And it may or may not be may or may not be the CISO, right? It may or may not be the board. It may or may not be the CEO. Um, but as a decentralized problem, we know that it exists everywhere between multiple silos and departments, right? Risk and legal and user error and compliance and IT, and everyone's got a stake in this issue. So it's important.
so you touch on something that we talked about when we were planning this podcast, and that's the idea that within virtually every corporation, there's an organizational chart, and there are sort of direct reports up through the C-suite, and then the board, and then there's a reporting cycle, and it's maybe quarterly sort of briefings or whatever it might be. When you think about the way you structure to address cyber risk, where does the org chart create risk? The obvious thing that we're going to get into, that's you touched on the psychology and the human nature of this, is the CISO, or the Chief Information Security Officer, which is the what I joke when we first spoke was the sort of new kid on the block, and then arrived at middle school, and everyone's sussing him out and not quite sure whether they should let him sit at the cool kids table and that sort of thing. And there is this very kind of human dynamic to integrating the new idea and the new concerns into existing structure. It sounds like something that should be relatively easy, like just, you know, from the point of leadership, a CEO just says, "Do this, do that," and it happens. What we know
Yeah,
is that's not how things happen.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
wonder whether you might sort of talk about the way, just the simplicity of the organizational chart and where the CISO sits in the reporting structure that can impact, the level of, I guess, put it very simply, fear that can
yes.
be generated around cyber and cyber risk, and as a result of that fear, the money to spend on the prevention flows.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on. I mean, I think a lot of times organizations will look to appoint an individual, an expert into this role, the CISO. And oftentimes that CISO reports to IT. Sometimes they sit adjacent or next to a few couple companies I work with. We worked really hard to position the CISO as a board connected position. So reporting to the CEO or the CEO or C suite, and ancillary from the IT lead. And I think doing that is actually really good because in most cases, the incentives do not necessarily consistently overlap between the CISO and the head of IT. And so Unfortunately, however, I'll throw this in here in terms of who actually fulfills that role and that responsibility. Sometimes the very people that are appointed to be CISOs are themselves technical experts, right? And so they think of their domain in a kind of a zero sum way, right? It's this or nothing. It's a binary approach towards security. But the really talented CISOs, the one that think about risk in a multi-layered way that's not binary, start to see gradations of this. That risk is not a one size fits all approach, and in that way, they actually have to engage with a huge number of stakeholders in the organization to increase and have impact. And the ones that do, the ones that are really deploying leadership, and when I say leadership, I mean facilitating the success of others to see this problem as adaptive and therefore make progress on the issue. The ones that do are incredibly effective. And even then, they have hard roads ahead of them because of the nature of the challenge is viewed as so technical. That makes sense.
It does. I mean, it makes me think that, within the other C-suite, like the CFO
Yep.
or, chief
Yep.
legal counsel, there is an annualized reality to, say, the budget, and then
That's right.
there's quarterly reality to the budget, and then there's the everyday reality of the finance of expense reports and
Yeah.
making the phone bill get paid. These things come with a regular, long-standing cadence now,
Yeah.
30-day billing cycles,
Yeah.
a bill every month from American Express for the travel, and we're going to spend this much a month or this much a quarter on whatever it might be. And not unlike when you consider the cyber insurance world now, where you see this evolution of much more adaptive, constant, like MDR and sort of
Yep.
24/7, 365 monitoring. The
Yep.
CISO has to have they have to adapt from, if they've come from a technical background, moving up into the C-suite, where you have to sort of
Yes.
become you're at the top. You're looking down across the entire company.
Yep.
For the
Yep.
groups that have existed in the C-suite for a long time, there's a lot of track record in how to make that happen, and the problems, while they exist, are predictable. So there's, if you will, data about what it is you're going to wind up dealing with, and that is something that you know is coming. And the C-suite's the CISO is not, pardon me, the CISO is not quite that person because A, it's new, and B, the digital realm touches every part of the company, whereas the finance realm or the legal realm or the marketing realm are more siloed. Now, we know that in corporations, siloing is something that can have value for the purposes of efficiency, but it also creates communication problems, and
Yep.
then
Yep.
perhaps even competitive problems. While you
Yeah.
maybe want your C-suite to be competitive, you don't want them trying to destroy each other.
Right.
Um, there is the need for this to be now integrated. Is it literally sort of like a situation where you have to reorganize it and just reframe everyone's mindset about their interaction with this particular power structure within the leadership of a company?
So now it's a great question because what your question gets at is organizational dynamics. And, um, you inferred this, but I'll say it. And that is that an effective CISO is actually building coalitions, right? That means that they're viewed as not just a central expert and a resource, but actually as a driver for dispersing risk, right? Because we know in this issue, risk is actually diffuse. You can have someone 4 layers down, click on an email and trigger a phishing scam, right? And they're as much culpable as anyone else in the organization for a widespread outage or failure. And so, yeah, I mean, in a way, right, this issue doesn't lend itself to a simple authority as the expert who can make the rules and set the limits, because the issue is much bigger than that, right? It hits everyone. So I think CISO as coalition builder is actually a way to think about leadership in this role, right? And when we think about that, it's about how do you enable and empower. And unfortunately, as I said, we've worked with a couple of companies even recently where um, the CISO and the head of IT are frankly the CTO are frankly at odds because it's almost like they're competing for those limited resources. And the reality is, in this issue, like so many issues, but particularly this issue, the board and other executives within the enterprise are incentivized to tighten those resources, right? To restrict margin, to increase revenue, and so Unfortunately, it's one of those areas that often gets short shrift. It doesn't get the attention that it deserves, until there's a crisis. And that's that asymmetry we talked about around success and failure, right?
I mean, I'm sure you've seen way more than me, but I see a fair share of reports about the the role of CISOs, the burnout of CISOs,
Yeah. Oh,
the how I mean, it's less than 3 years, the average in position. I feel like I've read in some reports. I don't know, there's a lot of these reports out there, but one of the things that I've always thought is that, the difficulty most companies have comes down to leadership, and I don't mean big companies, I mean all companies,
you
because it's
got
very easy to come up with an idea for, "I'm gonna sell T-shirts on Etsy," and that sort of thing. If you wanna scale that, you have to be able to, not unlike an IT back, sort of CISO has to step outside of their past into this new realm. You have to adapt to this kinda complex reality of delivering a message that people maybe think they've heard. You touched on that, and you just touched on it now, this sort of drop-in idea of, like, you can't just drop in another person. There has to be a an adaptive ability. Do you think it's something that a company needs to be more aggressive about, or should they be looking for CISOs that can build that coalition all on their own? You want
oh,
someone
I
really strong.
Right. Well, that's a great question, because now you're talking about fundamentally what makes effective leadership at any level, but particularly at the CISO level. And I think, in an ideal world, right, all the senior level executives, including the board, they are adaptive in how they think and behave and move through systems and build coalitions. I think at least we're really fortunate to work with some really effective CISOs. You pointed out that the burnout rate is extremely high. And so cycling back to that point for just a second, we even had a CISO. You and I talked about this in our pre-record around, potential personal liability that CISOs might be under related to risk, right? And needing an indemnification from that in some cases. Talk about a crazy world where if your CISO is now personally liable for the risks and issues of a multi-billion or trillion-dollar business. I mean, this is insanity. So the stakes are high, and I do think that really effective executives are the ones, including CISOs, are the ones that are thinking, diagnostically. They're thinking structurally. They're thinking about layers and engagement, including other authority dynamics within systems. Because if they don't, right, what's the risk to them and their personal success? They actually onboard this risk, this tension, and that's why the burnout is so high because they simply can't do it by themselves, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the point I sort of was getting at is just that, this idea that the leadership failures are often why things don't go right. It's not
Spot
the
on.
idea, it's not the
Yeah.
marketplace, it's the execution and the direction and clarity of goal that's set. I mean, the catchphrase that jumped to my mind is sort of the HR world, or maybe it's more than that, to be honest, is the soft skills, right? What I'm hearing you say is that a CISO with technical knowledge, and whether they're capable of actually doing technical things themselves,
Yeah.
and the ability to communicate why these things matter. Is it is it down to something like that simple? I mean, when you talk about coalition building and, you know, I guess the word politics or office politics or corporate politics comes in, or, the sort of psychological tools we can get to bring people around and recognize certain training might work. There's I mean, in some respects, as my mind starts to think about this question, is that the CISO needs to be one of the more dynamic executives in a company of any size, given the complexity.
Totally agree with you, particularly as the size of the company grows, because not only do they have to have very robust technical skill set, but they have to have a dynamic human skill set. And I'll say that, I think the world of leadership often gets reduced down to this idea of soft skills, and in some cases for good reason. But what we're seeing in the burgeoning world of AI, even, that where fundamentally all the cognitive, linear driven and cognitive work will effectively be outsourced to a great degree. Those human skills, are actually becoming increasingly important, and part of those human skills are the leadership skills. My mentor, a guy, that I studied from and learned at Harvard, talks about, the true definition of leadership. He says is disappointing people at a rate that they can sustain. And it's kind of funny when you think about it, but from an experiential lens, right? All of our CISOs that we work with, they feel the same. It's like no matter what I do, I have to disappoint someone in order to convert behavior and create coalition and build allies and build partnerships even internal to the organization. And it's like pulling teeth, right? And I often tell these folks, welcome to leadership. That's exactly what it's like. And it's not a one and done thing, right? It's a multi-scalar, a creative, long-term, consistent, dynamic effort. And so I think, Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is an effective leader. It often takes, significant effort to understand the system in a way that you can operate with efficacy and impact. And as that increases, when I say, well, what is efficacy and impact? Let's not reduce it to just basic KPIs of cyber incursions, but let's think about cyber more in terms of building resilience, not response ready. And I think too many CISOs actually do that. They think of it, oh, I'm doing my job because we have a plan of attack, right? We have the playbook, we have the response, we have the all of the dynamic tools and outcomes that we know we're going to pursue. But do they actually have resilience? It's different from knowing how to run a race and actually running the race, right? One requires lived stamina and practiced endurance. So very different scopes for effective CISOs, I think.
You remind me of a piece of advice I was given early in my career when I first started managing people, and it was to not delay conversations that I was dreading having, and
Yes,
the
good advice.
difficult conversations, once you have them, you typically only regret having had the
Yeah,
conversation.
spot on. Yeah, spot
Uh,
on.
that advice proved to be true. It took me a while to, quote unquote, to use the word of the day, adapt to that mindset, right? Like there was a line I had to cross where I had to become comfortable being uncomfortable in that situation with people that maybe I'd been peers with. And this idea that you could pluck someone out of a, say, an IT department, which has, a really tight environment in my experience in corporations. And now this person has to be, spread more thinly across the I guess I wonder whether or not that sort of psychological growth that's required is something that, is there advice to a CISO about how to deal with that if someone's been approached or they're getting this promotion or they've just taken on this role about, becoming, I guess, not less technical, but
Yeah,
more something else, right? You
yeah,
you you have to add to
yeah.
grow into this role, and there are certainly resources out there to do that. But I wonder whether you might have some, one-off advice for a CISO
Gosh,
in the making.
yeah, I wish there was some magic pixie dust. I'll say a couple things maybe, and that is that, oftentimes in our world, when we think about what does it take to really lead, to actually mobilize people to do complex things, to create progress on complex issues, um, it's not just insight, right? It's not just being smart. Unfortunately, being smart has very little correlation to actively engaging effective behavior. So I would say to any CISO who is now in that role or moving into that space, I'd probably tell him or her, look, your job is no longer to be smart. Your job is not actually to be a problem solver of technical issues. Your job is to think more broadly, actually in some cases to be dumb, right? And learn. Deeply listen to the systems, deeply listen to the stakeholders, understand even the positioning of the issue within the organization so that you could do the critical tasks of garnering resources, gaining support, mobilizing people, training people, in some cases, creating safe environments so that even those multiple layers down, will report incursions or threats. Sometimes we see that the problem is a lack of psychological safety in environments because it's viewed as a risk if I report that I've made a mistake, right? So very different role. I think an effective CISO, it doesn't mean, by the way, it doesn't mean they don't have those technical skills. It means that those are deployed in service of the broader organizational vision and mission. And I think that could be said true also for really any C suite executive. I mean, you want a CEO or a CTO or a CHRO to think broadly about how their function engages the overall success of the business. So at the end of the day, Yoda said, do or do not, there is no try, right? It's fundamentally about behavior. Can that individual move into that spot and do the hard work of mobilizing people to make that change? That's the question, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I forget what the stat is about how many small businesses fail within the first 18 months or something like that, and I
Most of them.
remember, yeah, most of them, and I remember
Yeah.
thinking that that's not down to the idea or the colors or the, whatever it might be. That's
Yep.
typically down to leadership, right? Even if it's
Yes.
your own company, being a leader is this next layer of burden where you're, um you're taking yourself outside of what your passion is to make a certain product or, whatever, provide a certain service. And now you have to scale that and monetize it
Oh,
and
spot
do the
on.
taxes and all those things. And it's this layer of burden. And then if you've got employees that, maybe they're not ideal because people are complex, and it is one of those things that I think gets overlooked. You get the chance. It doesn't mean you're gonna make good with it, right? Like, lots of people make the big leagues and they don't have glorious careers.
You're so spot on. I mean, we can see that from the transition from high school athletics to college athletics to professionals. In almost every domain, we can see that. And you mentioned the word scale, and that's true for CISOs as well. I know of a few folks that have been in CISOs type positions or in that suite, and as the company grows, so do the requirements grow, so do the demands grow, so does the budget we hope grow. And in that way, oftentimes the need to change behavior also grows. So that expression, what got you here won't get you there, absolutely true of leadership. This is why most startup entrepreneurs, we're veering from the cyber for a second, but this is why most cyber startup entrepreneurs do not last throughout the duration of the growth of the enterprise. Very much true in venture capital and equity worlds, where a co-founder or founder might take it from 0 to 20 million, but then struggles to get it past 50 or 150 in some cases. So spot on. I think the challenge of human behavior change is itself an adaptive issue, and we can apply that to cyber, as I'm sure we'll keep talking about here. But so hard to change our behavior.
We're gonna shift it to cyber in a sec, but I feel like the trope that you see when it's probably in sitcoms and movies is that the startup guys are all in their hoodies and hang out in one room in someone's house, and they scale up and they've got some, funding, and now they realize they got to get a real office, and the board suddenly decides they need to have an adult CEO who can come in and, like,
Spot
be
on.
the adult in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. Happens all the time. And even with CISOs, hey, we need a real CISO. And all that means is someone who's stage appropriate to the behaviors and requirements of typically where we're headed, maybe not where we are right now. Yeah, I mean, I think the same could be said for not just scale, but also innovation, right? Or even disruption in the marketplace. So that same kind of mindset could be used for a CISO who maybe has an incursion. Well, how do we deal with this now? Right? What do we do now? How do we adapt to the pressures and stresses that maybe are realized that we hadn't seen before, as opposed to treat it like a technical band-aid and we're going to just cover it up. I mean that also I think is a behavioral data point for CISOs. How did you handle failure in the context of an incursion? And if we can look at the behavioral data on that, then we might learn about their capacity to lead as well. Yeah,
When it comes to leading, a lot of times that's getting people that you may feel inferior to, like perhaps the board, to recognize what it is they need to say yes to, or to encourage the company to do from a point of view of being cyber resilient or cyber ready. And the boards tend to push, if I recall our conversation, readiness, right? The idea, but resilience is the capacity to deal with what everyone says is not if but when, right? It's
yeah,
always coming.
yep,
So
yep.
just to frame this readiness versus resilience, you told a great story about a cyber security response, incident response, and the idea that suddenly nobody could talk to anyone. And there was a reason for that. Do you remember this? I'll remind you with more if you don't. But
Yeah, keep going because I have like 5
so
examples in my head.
nobody knew anyone's phone numbers.
Oh, yes. Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
tell
yeah,
me
yeah.
about. So you see, that suddenly nothing works.
Yeah,
Your phone doesn't open, and you're like, oh really? I don't remember anything with my childhood phone number, and that's not going to do me any good.
yeah, and the irony, that company was not and we work with all types and sizes, but in the case that you're talking about, the example we discussed, this was a, very probably, $100 million, very large commercial, roofing company. And they go, "Oh, that's interesting," but well, even they can get hacked, right? They're not thinking about cyber threats, but they had some cyber protection in place. Sure enough, there was an incursion, um, complete disruption and hijacking of their system. It was a ransomware situation. They wanted $1 million, and literally all of the backup data, and the original data and backup data were both corrupted. Literally, no one had any phone numbers unless you were pre-programmed into your phone. Right? There were no backup plans. There were no. There was very little resilience. Now, this organization, they did have a baseline readiness approach, and it's ultimately what saved them in the end. It took them almost 6 weeks, almost 2 months to actually recover the data. They ended up not paying the ransom. But the reality is that's not resilience, right? It would be like, yeah, I probably can run the race. Maybe I can run a half marathon, but am I going to run it in pain and tear my Achilles, right? Or do I actually have the capacity to do it when the pressure is on? And so think when we think about this specific issue, right, we're comparing readiness and resilience. And I think boards, they push what I call the artifacts of readiness, right, which are policies, playbooks, backup systems, plans and roadmaps. And they're great. That's sort of par for the course. That's important. But real resilience is, okay, when push comes to shove, can we actually operate under stress? When people are pointing fingers, can we coordinate across silos? Can we do we have a practiced response when things go wrong? What would you do in this case, right? So moving past playbooks into scenario planning, and then almost simulation in some cases. The really great CISOs and organizations will actually run some simulations. I live in off the coast of Seattle here, and will occasionally the city and the local state will do local government and state will do earthquake drills, right? So everyone hears about it in the radio, and we want to practice that because the big one is due. So are we doing the same thing with cyber threats? The problem is, particularly at the board level, um, folks that view authority in the system as really the arbiter of decision making are often not pushed back against, right? So if the board is restricting assets and resources by virtue of the CEO, oftentimes the CISOs, they just say, okay, well, I guess we can't do it. And that's the wrong way to think about creating resilience, right? There are many things that can be done, even on low budgets or virtually no budgets, to build that capacity within the org. Yeah.
You remind me of the scenario. Once upon a time, I worked at a large corporate media company, and I ran a unit that would do hour-long documentaries. And a lot of these documentaries were done very quickly. So there'd be an event in the news, and on Tuesday you'd be told they wanted an hour of TV for Friday night. Now this was a large media organization. We had a lot of resources. I had a staff as many as 16, and when time goes away, there's only so much you can do, right? Setting that part of it aside, what really, really helped is when I empowered the staff to not wait for me to say yes or for me to be there to communicate with someone, say, in the graphics department or the edit department or the travel department or camera crew department. The idea that they could cross these silos and move through these sort of, structural organizational barriers in moments like that specifically
Yep.
to get things done.
Yep.
Is that when you touched on incident response, and the phrase I was expecting to hear very quickly was the famous tabletop exercise, which kind of betrays what is actually happening because that's the last place you really want to just do it. But this idea that you create a mindset that there is in those moments, in moments of crisis, there's this need to, and I want to say kumbaya, but get along, be able to step across each other's silo wall and show up and be like, hey, I'm Billy. We met before, but that needs to happen before the crisis. Is that part of the
Oh,
sort of leadership idea?
absolutely spot on. I might be preempting, maybe one of your questions, but when we think about resilience, one of the big tells when resilience doesn't exist, and maybe we'll go in the inverse in just a second, is when people point fingers and play the blame game, and that happens all the time. It happens in every organization. The question is to what extent. And so I call that behavior, and my mentor calls that behavior work avoidance. They're actually doing the they're avoiding the real work, right? And so leadership in some ways is the opposite of that. It's avoiding work avoidance. It's effectively doing the work. And so, there are a couple kind of key indicators when a system has resilience. One is agency, right? Like you just said, your story is a perfect example of that. Do people have agency to proactivate and engage in the solutions that might be risky, but that probably make sense, even if they make mistakes, right? And so agency implies some kind of safety. That's the second piece, right? That there's an element of safety within the organization to solve the problem. So I would say, agency, relationship, and solutions. Solution orientation is a critical piece of this, right? Too often in large fractured organizations, people are hoarding their piece of the pie. But I think if the relationship isn't built, then how do you deploy solutions in the context of no agency? It's just impossible. So spot on. Yep.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, when you see an incident break down or the incident response breaks down, is it any one particular thing? Is it the tools, the process, the relationships? I mean, it
I
seems to
think
me it could be
it's usually, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's usually the confluence of all of those, and we get what we call a perfect storm, right? And often say that, the biggest leadership failure in organizations is misdiagnosing an adaptive problem as a technical problem. It would be like going to the doctor, right, and saying, "Hey, my elbow hurts," and the doctor says, "Let's go straight to surgery." And you say, "Hold on, wait, let's. How about an X-ray?" "No, I've seen it before. Let's go straight to surgery." "What about an MRI?" "Nope, under the knife." Right. So this inability to really understand the multiple layers of relationship, of response, of agency, of resourcing, of planning, it just compounds the problem, and then in the postmortem, right? Typically, the unsophisticated and unofficiated are pointing to the technical issues of why it failed. But that's just the surface, right? The real issue is due to a lack of coordinated response. It's due to the limitations of agency. It's people not feeling empowered or having zero relationship across silos that could actually be useful to recover phone numbers and do other backup critical issues or tasks. So yeah, unfortunately, it's usually a confluence of many uh, perfect storm events, maybe like a black swan event in some cases, right? Particularly for the large breaches. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm feeling a bit nostalgic here. I touched on my past in corporate media and documentaries, and I'm just remembering you get the assignment, and what I think what enters you is absolute dread. How the hell is any of this going to get done? Is the first thought, even as the leader, I would have. And then I'd sit
Yeah.
down with the staff, and maybe there'd be people on the phone, and we'd have a big planning meeting, organize the show, come up with a. I always use something called the backward planning sequence, particularly on short-term things like this, to help organize us and not get too big of the idea. I had some great colleagues. I remember now at like the end of these 45 or hour-long meetings, you'd send people off to go and do their work, and it was like a great relief. Like you sort of set this amazing energy sort of loose onto the entire world to go gather what it needed to solve the problem we had, which was we don't have a TV show yet, and we need one by 9 o'clock Friday night. So
I
yeah,
I love that story because Martin, what that reveals about human nature is so fascinating because it connects directly to leadership, which is that when people have clarity around what they need to do, right, they can focus their skill set and their talents in ways that are incredibly productive. But how do you get to that point where, right, where we don't have, the alpha telling us what to do? In some cases, we need that, right? And you in that case were that. In some cases, we don't have that. So I often think about, I'll say this to C-suite executives and other senior leaders: if it feels easy, then chances are you're probably not leading, right? If it feels easy, then you're probably not doing real work that moves the needle on critical issues that unfortunately others experience as resistant, right? So I think that's usually a pretty good litmus test. If it feels hard, congratulations, welcome to leadership, right?
yeah, yeah. It is. It's a um. I'm trying to whether I should equate it to like a good workout in the gym and how you feel when you stop exercising. But the dilemma with leadership is it's always there, particularly in a place like cyber, and the threats are 24/7, 365 is the phrase,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
One of the things that
Yeah.
we touched on, and sort of the next section is it gets us into this idea, but trust is cyber infrastructure, and a sort of case study. The line I've written down for myself is I wonder if there's like one wow story of a breach that proves the governance point that's an example of how when it's done right or organized right or prepared right that things go well. And do you remember that part?
Yeah,
Like,
I'm thinking of a legacy company that we worked with, a company that's almost 100 years old, and they have mills all over the country that were not updated to current technology requirements. And um, yeah, I remember the story because our CISO actually had to fight against IT to put in the required tools, both to remotely monitor and to protect individual mills. And what should have taken 6 months was a 3.5 year process. In fact, they had bought the physical hardware and all the infrastructure, which was located at the mills, but there was such resistance to installing the firewalls and the blocks that it became a political feud, right? And so, Fortunately, in this case, there wasn't a specific threat that actually materialized, but it was a 3.5 year process of navigating with the head of IT, the CTO, to actually integrate this in a way that was cost effective and efficient. And if you ask any CISO, well, shouldn't that be an easy job? They'd say, of course, technically it's straightforward, but it's not about the application of hardware. It's about the solutioning mindset of the folks that are blocking you, right? And in cases like that, you see turf wars all the time. Turf wars between what's yours and what's mine, and whose resource and who can you use to deploy it, and why do you get that and I don't? It's really unfortunate because that's work avoidance. And yeah, I've seen a couple cases of national things that you probably have read, national incidents and response around incursion and risk, and the ones that don't end well are typically the ones where the systemic failure is not viewed as a learning opportunity, right? If the culture is actually built and predicated upon let's learn through this failure to become stronger, amazing resilience can be cultivated and developed. But when you then fire half the team, and that's symptomatic of what often ends up in the CISO world and cybersecurity, which is mea culpa, or pointing fingers, and it's just unfortunate because those orgs tend not to evolve and adapt in ways that they need to, at least not
You
as
you
quickly. Yeah,
you touched on leadership should feel hard, right?
yeah,
You should feel a little bit burdened. And when you, as you talk then about the scenario where you've got the IT solution, you've got the technical solution, but convincing people to implement it and put it in place took another 3.5 years. Sounds to me like an example where even at the CEO level, they need to recognize, oh, hey, now it's time for me to have some difficult conversations and tell people to get in line. Because if you look across the globe at what happens to companies that suffer a cyber breach of any scale, like Land Rover Jaguar, Marks and Spencers, MGM, the cost, both reputationally and then the long tail of, whether it's data breach issues and data issues or just lost business, it's extremely damaging. And that is something that the if you will, North Star of a company, the
yeah,
CEO or the
yeah,
chairman, I suppose, depending on your structure, they
yeah.
need to get around this idea and realize, oh man, I need to make sure that the CISO feels like I've got their back. Is
Yes.
that something that you see, or
Oh
you sort of
gosh, man, I wish more CEOs had that enlightened posture and perspective. Oftentimes the CISO are viewed as plug and play, and you're just another cog in the chain of risk protection, which means more cost for me. But I think in an ideal world, yes, and I'm recalling now the example that you and I probably talked about, which is a very small business. I think maybe 3 or 4 million in revenue. Uh, maybe a quick aside here. So just a few weeks ago, client wired money, $90,000, lost to a scam that had gotten through the system. And you talk about the branding impacts of that and the devastating downstream issues with the client. And even in a small business, you know they didn't have cyber insurance. They now do. Guess what? They now do. But the impact of brand and operations, my gosh, it was massive. And this is a company that thought they were doing everything right with no CISO, right? So I mean, I think to your point, how do you really help organizational leaders, I say people in positions of authority, including the board and the C-suite, including the CEO, understand the merits and value of effective work on this, right? And I don't just mean funding, right, for more security protocols. I mean relationship building, and the navigation of silos, which certainly they're experiencing in other domains. So it's connecting those dots for them, right? And yeah, I agree. In an ideal world, the CEO's got your back. And for all of our CISOs listening, if they've got a CEO that's supportive, hold on to that CEO. It's great.
yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that's fascinating most about this last few years of journalism for me is that I went into cyber insurance and cybersecurity reporting thinking it was all going to be technical, and so much of it's not even close to that. I
Right.
mean, you think about you touched on it just now, and I remember thinking it when you told me that story about the $90,000 fraudulent wire transfer. The and I've only seen a few sort of studies about this. The psychological impact on a department when one of their members clicks the phishing link and it actually results in some sort of really substantial issue for the
Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
That this, there is this still very common sort of vibe that the person who clicks the phishing link is the one who made the mistake, who's the bad guy or gal, and that it's not the sophisticated multinational organized crime network that's backed by a
Right.
nation state, right? Like
Right.
this idea that is there. In that context, we also talked about earlier the idea that CISOs have in some of the reporting I've done and some of the sort of surveys of CISOs that you see come across the transom. This idea that unlike other C-suite executives, they like to talk to CISOs at other companies because the threats that they're seeing are
Yes.
shared, but also dynamic. So a
Yes.
CISO might get threat intelligence from someone they work with or something they read that is not, there's so many of them. There's
Yeah.
so much to keep up with that
Yeah.
there's a lot, right? There's a lot of incoming, and that collaborative across even company silos is something that I've seen CISOs talk about, which is very counter, particularly if you're talking about a competitive company, to the general mindset. And I wonder whether or not, like, is there something to do about that, or is there like like, is there a rubber room for CISOs where they can go in, they can talk about stuff, but except for the threat stuff, every other secret stays in the room, or something like that, a code of
Yeah.
silence?
Yeah, there are a few. There many people have informal networks, and there are a few, particularly localized and regional forums. There's probably a couple national actually, where CISOs gather and ideas share. And I this is one of those domains that probably like CFOs, depending on if you're an accounting or operations focused CEO or you're an M&A. There are experts in all of these domains, but I think the CISO position specifically lends itself to learning and integrating, because a lot of what the threat landscape looks like is really not about the innovative or proprietary IP or knowledge of your company. It's about how to defend from an external threat. We actually did a project, and maybe you remember talking about this in our pre-call, with an entity. I think I've told you the story. So several years ago, the U.S. government actually spoke to the world's largest banks, U.S. banks, I should say, top 5 banks, and said, "Look, there's a lot of cyber risk in the financial system, and we're worried about the financial architecture in this country. So if you don't create an entity that shares this, to your point around sharing, then we will do it for you." So they said, "No, no, we'll do it." So the 5 biggest banks created an entity called the Center for Resilience and Risk. I think they've changed the names a couple times, but this is an entity, a quasi-private public sector entity that would interface between the CIA, FBI, DHS, and NSA and the major banks. And they'd take all of the banks' cyber data, individual bank cyber data, which most of them don't really want to share. They'd anonymize it, right? They'd put it through their machine and then compare it to all of the governmental security data. And then they'd use this in a collective effort to actually prevent incursions and actually, in some cases, target major bad actors in the international marketplace. Talk about, doing adaptive work. Talk about creating system structures and processes that can do the work that would otherwise be deeply technical, but also risk sharing too much, right, on an individual level. So I think there's an example where, maybe at an organizational level, where this is, really powerful and effective. But to do that at both the individual and the org level, really great idea. Really great idea. Yeah.
I don't want to put a pin in that because what you're
Yeah.
describing there is contrary to so much of what people learn in business
Yeah.
school. This idea that you would, willingly, I mean, we hear about shadow AI and people
Yeah.
putting things into AI and all that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Like the idea that you would share stuff that is vital to your success or ongoing success, however you want to phrase it, in this way. In the UK, you see cyber resilience on a national scale being framed by the government as a function of basically protecting the country. And that while the threat of a cyber attack is not bombs from the sky, the damage can be just as great, whether it's
Massive.
closing in. The line I like is if someone had used a bomb to blow up a Jaguar factory, it would have been on the cover of the paper for weeks and there would have been, parliamentary inquiries. But because it was a cyber attack that, I mean, the GDP of the UK took a hit. I think the government shelled out at $1.5 billion. We're talking about real money here to
Yeah.
prevent companies from going out of business and thousands of people from losing their jobs. There is sort of a a need for that idea that these threats are that it's not normal crime. It's not a
Yeah.
fire burning your warehouse down. And
Yeah.
that mindset is one that is still, with the help of people like you, making its way into the leadership mentality and mindset of companies of every size. Is I mean, I know it's a bit of an aside, but is that
No,
something that you see?
you spot on. There's a psychological principle that we call the normalcy bias, which actually refers to exactly that, right? So it hasn't happened yet, so therefore it won't happen. That would be a version. That would be one version of that. Another version is, well, it happened, but no one died, so therefore it's okay. And the problem is neither of those are adequate. Certainly, they're not adequate to projecting and planning and leading through that before the encounter, right? And so, yeah, it's a funny thing because particularly in this area too, we have diffusion of responsibility. And so, like the Jaguar incident, I mean, massive disruptive impacts. Um, and yet the issue, the conversation always turns to, well, whose fault is it? Right. Not to how do we prevent this from happening again in the future? What's the real work in this case? It's to prevent this from happening in the future, right? I mean, that's the important stuff. So it's a new landscape. I'm also starting to look at what AI is doing to security. I'm sure you've got a bunch of experts that know how to think about that, but curious on your perspective on how that's shaping this as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to share it. As you were talking just then, I was like, "We're gonna get lucky" is not a business plan.
Right, spot
I mean,
on.
it's all right to think as your head hits the pillow, maybe I'll get lucky, but, don't plan on, right? Like,
Yeah,
make your
yeah,
luck.
yep,
Listen, I think I said to you when we spoke that I view AI like a lot of things, and the example I've used, and I've been trying to write something for my Substack about, is that AI has the capacity particularly from an intellectual point of view and a creative point of view to energize the next 100 years of human thinking and the results of it, the same way the steam engine energized the industrial age.
yeah, yeah,
Now, you got to get a lot right. And it's fair to say you might argue that I'm not even talking about, pardon me, global warming, but with the industrial age, we got a lot wrong. And the number of Superfund sites would be evidence of that, or
yep,
the labor laws that allowed way more people to die building railroads than they should have, or bridges than they should have. Those are examples of that. To not repeat those sorts of mistakes as we move into AI is one of the ways we keep everyone optimistic about it, and embracing the idea that okay, cars do crash, but on balance they're way better than whatever the horse, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure people would debate. But also that when we created the car, it didn't have seat belts or airbags or a
right,
lane avoidance detection or whatever that else might come along for generations after the Model T hit the sort of assembly line, if you will.
yep,
So I
yep,
think that in that context, not unlike leadership, this idea needs to be one where you get up every day knowing you did a lot yesterday and there's a lot to do today. Some
yeah,
of it you're going to get done, some of it's going to go the way you want, and then some of it's going to fall victim to the plans of adversaries or the
yes,
weather or all sorts of things that the future has in mind that we don't control.
yep,
So
yep,
again, I think that I mean, it's really interesting to be honest, and I think that when you touched on it just now, and I thought of it was its ability to go through data, which obviously is the big conversation
yes,
now with
yep,
the lawsuit between the government and Anthropic about, but the amount of information we collect and the amount of threat data there is. I mean, I listened to a podcast over the weekend, and I think there's a single U.S. government agency that collects so much data that it would take 8 million employees a year to go through what they collect in a year, which is obviously not practical, right?
yeah,
Like you would never
yeah,
hire that many people. You couldn't afford to hire that many people. So I think that that's one way I see AI working very quickly for raw material. Like it turns 1,000 pounds of dirt into a 1 carat diamond in the same way 10,000 people might in the intellectual sense, right?
yeah, yeah,
The technical side of it and the coding part of it, I dare say that's a bit beyond me. But what I do know is, particularly with the coding, that is enormously labor intensive, right? It takes a lot of time to write good code, and it needs to be constantly improved, and that sort of thing. The idea that you could augment that with a tool
yeah,
basically
yeah,
is one that makes it clear to me that there's enormous value in the way that this can take. Listen, we barely know how much of our brain works. The idea that we've created a tool that can help it work more efficiently,
yes.
and that's where I think that there's I'm optimistic.
Well,
I don't know, green
maybe
red flag or red flag, but that's what I have to say about it.
that's fascinating, and I've heard reports too recently about the use of AI to tighten security holes, within platforms that could actually be a massive boost for the security infrastructure and approach for future safety. And so maybe there's an upside there too, to reduce the overall risk profile
Yeah,
of
yeah.
incidents. But
Yeah. Again, I mean, it's v someone made fun of this comment, and I don't know, I made the mistake of reading the comments on some social media post of this
oops,
previous podcast, which was, again, like, that's my fault. Um, but the joke, and it is a joke, but it's simplified. A hammer can drive the nail home, or if you misuse it, it's gonna smash your thumb. Now, that is
yes,
incredibly simplified, and there's way more scale to the
yeah,
AI question than anything, but from a basic point of view, that's kinda how I look at it. Now some people use hammers well to this day, and they've been around a while, and some people don't, and you get good and bad, which I
yeah.
don't think is ever gonna go away. So this idea that we can make it all good or make it all bad is kind of a foolish argument. Like,
It's a fantasy.
we need a more adaptive approach
Yeah,
to this problem. So
spot on, spot on. Well, I'm
um,
with you, and that adaptive piece is really about how do we change the needed behavior at the organizational level across people to make something productive, right, and improve
yeah, yeah,
progress. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, without removing their agency, because you that was really interesting. You touched on human agency and the sort of automated or artificial agency. The idea that we could find a way to combine those to great output is what I believe possible.
yep.
And I'm hoping to be around to see that unfold to a
We're
degree. So
optimists, Martin. We're optimists.
I am an optimist. I'm an American, not an American.
Well, I right, I am too, and that's why I think that's why I do the work that I do because I believe that people, when properly motivated, they want to make a difference in the world. They want to
I
make an impact. You
I
know,
I I completely I mean, again, we're so far from the cyber insurance world now, it's all people, right? Like, this
yeah,
idea that people are solving these problems, and I think that you're absolutely right. The Given the tools, the resources, and the clarity about what it is they're trying to do, there's not much people can't achieve barring the impossible, like, flying without being in an airplane, that kind of stuff. So,
agreed. Yeah,
I,
spot on.
I but speaking of the
Yeah,
impossible, and we know this in corporations,
yep,
if you come asking for money, you're the cost center and nobody likes you. They love the profit center, but the cost center and cybersecurity is viewed as a spend. So the board goes, ugh. Now, what we're increasingly seeing is the idea that, oh, we can spend $1 million today, and it'll save us 50 million next year, maybe, or it'll make the breach that we know is coming, and everyone says we should expect manageable because we've done IR, incident response, and we've done proper tabletop exercises, and we've got our plan written down, and there's a copy of it in a safe in every executive's home, so we can make phone calls to people and we actually reach each other. I
yeah,
wanted to talk about that sort of cost center chronic condition that exists, that psychology of a CISO needs to take to the board to get the right funding so that they can get the cybersecurity in place that makes MFA genuinely sort of the way it's supposed to be, so that their cyber insurance premiums come down. So the cost center five that this world
yeah,
can bring to boards is
yeah,
maybe a little bit reduced by recognizing that one of the reasons we have employee benefits is because employees
yep,
that are well taken care of, they
yes,
work better, right? We
yeah.
don't. So tell me a bit about that sort of weird part of this psychology.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, I think the current security context and state of risk is what we would think of as a chronic condition. It's an overlay that exists. It's like the human condition, right? And so, unfortunately, as we discussed earlier, that a lot of executives and boards want to treat this as a technical problem. And so, when there's a technical problem, it's really easy to prescribe, solutions. Well, here's the bandage. Here's the training that you need to do. Here's the security solution deployment that's required. But it's just not that simple. And so I think part of what the CISO has to do, or the folks handling security at this level, they need to use a few different tools to support the movement of this issue. And, no matter who we are in the context of leadership, to some extent, we're always selling. We're always about advocating for the things that we believe in. That's the non-cynical view of selling, and it's the one that I believe in. So CISOs that really believe in the critical security requirements for their organizations aren't just selling security; they're actually promoting a way of being within the enterprise that actually supports and optimizes a conditional set of behaviors and structures that support efficacy and impact. So I had a CISO that I worked with recently who used the fear tactic, and he said, "Look, if I use fear, I'm going to get more audience." And I said, "Yeah, I get that, but you can't just use fear." We talked a lot about the role of change in organizations, but people actually don't fear the change. They typically fear the losses associated with change. And so, like if I gave you a winning lottery ticket for 30 million bucks, you wouldn't say no thanks, right? You'd say, "Oh, okay, I'll take that." But the reality is, for lottery winners, they're more likely statistically to get divorced, to go bankrupt, to die prematurely. Whole bunch of bad ills and effects from winning the lottery, potentially, if not managed well. And yet that represents gain, right? So you got to help the boards and C-suite officers understand what the changes that you're advocating for imply, right? What are the gains that are associated with this change? What can we actually, instead of focusing on the fear, what's the upside of this? What's the positive downstream impact? That's the corollary to the risk if we do nothing, and that's hard. That's oftentimes future forecasting, planning exercises, and this is where I think oftentimes knowing other CISOs that have had examples or incursions or problems, using that data to paint a real picture becomes so important. So important.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a reality. You can get people in the door with fear, but you keep them with the fix, right?
That's right. You got to
There's
have the
gotta be
solution. Yeah.
there's like a takeaway and a
Well said.
solution.
Yeah.
Like, we see a lot of the same things happening again, like, we repeat the same failures, and we're at about an hour now, we've got a couple of topics left, so maybe
Okay.
we'll pick up the pace a little bit, but
Sure.
we see the same failures
Yeah.
repeat, and I wonder whether you could touch on why you think that is, what's happening that means, these another breach and another breach. Now, there's the obvious answer is there's a very sophisticated adversary here looking to steal from
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
But talk to me about what's sort of the barrier there on the other side of that coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that security issues are often framed is like where's the water getting through? Like a leaky roof, right? Where's the fence that's open? Where's the gate that's just letting this stuff in? And so we tend to stare at, well, who built it? Why is the gate open? How does the lock look on it? And in the organizational corollary, it's like, how do permissions work? How do silos compete? How do permissions work? Are we using multi-factor authentication and the technical solutions, or even how silos compete for budget, right? But that's old school thinking, right? I think effective CISOs have to go beyond that. They move past audits and they start thinking about readiness tests, right? They think about blending budgets and engaging budgets in productive ways. So these are not, binary solutions, Martin. These are deeply thought, well constructed, almost crafted approaches that are programmatic, structural, and planned. Right, and when they're well done, then you create buy-in across other organizations within or other silos within the company, to get people on board, and they become part of the solution. What's the great Huckleberry Finn Tom Sawyer vignette where Tom Sawyer gets Huck Finn to paint the fence for him because it's a great joy and privilege. That's a little disingenuous here, but part of it is understanding what's in everyone's best interest and making that really clear. So really important to stop diagnosing the technical components and think about the holistic capacity of the strategy connected to cyber. Really, really crucial. I know that's a lot of words, maybe not a lot of how to because every context is different, but by and large, I think that's a generic approach that I would recommend.
Yeah, I mean, the as far as we might feel, some of us that we've been in as long as we've been in the sort of technical information age, this idea that there's so much more of it is before us, and
Yes.
I think I use this analogy. It's almost like we've gotten to 30, 35 years old and gone to get a physical, and I've used this
Yeah.
analogy before. You know what, you can't keep going like this. You can, maybe eat a little more greens and, like, cut back on the drinking or lose a little weight
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
eventually this is gonna catch up to you, and we are in a moment now where this has caught up to us. The cost of cybercrime, the disruption. I mean, we know what happens. We've had a few technical outages lately with AWS
Yep.
and Verizon.
Cloudflare. Yep.
And, we are paralyzed when all of the things that we rely on in the cyber and digital sense
Yeah.
stop working. We
Yeah.
don't know where to go, and we can't actually call anyone because all our phones are, in a, digital device that we maybe can't get into properly because it's not
Yeah.
working right. I mean,
Yep.
yeah, it is interesting. as with everything, we sort of touched on AI, but when you think about the AI rewiring companies and sort of the governance issues around employees using AI and the CISO having to introduce this new thing, and back to the psychological pressure, particularly at a publicly traded company,
Yep.
everyone wants to be all AI, right? Oh, we're going to use these to be more efficient, and our next quarter is going to be better, and we're going to be able to do this. And we had, is it, um, Dorsey just laid off a ton of people at his company because the 40% of the staff is no longer needed, and that sort of thing. The new thing has a real appeal. You got quarterly reporting, and you got to seem like you're on the pulse of the latest this and that. How does that work for the CISO where suddenly it's like, "Oh, yeah, we gotta say we're doing AI, we gotta be using AI, make sure we're not getting, jeopardized security-wise. Have a nice weekend."
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is the current, probably the biggest current issue that they're thinking about, and where there's an AI acolyte or head, right? Some companies are now creating an AI, the chief of AI, chief AI officer, right, to contend with this. And now you introduce additional competition between the CTO and the chief AI officer and the CISO. And so now you say, well, now we're actually getting more complex. Now we actually have to, if AI is rewiring systems and decentralizing decision making, then how do we use a new governance model to support moving through in productive ways that create feedback loops, and that engage really the critical conversations at the right time? That's the challenge. I mean, that is the challenge. And to your point earlier, if it's like if we keep drinking soda, it's fine when you're 16 to some extent, but by the time you're 30 or 40 or close to my age, my gosh, the soda catches up to you pretty fast. And it's accretive, right? So meaning, and not necessarily for the better, but for the worse. And so if we're not on top of this, both AI and cyber connected infrastructure and work now, then I think it compounds. And when it does compound, by the way, you end up getting, massive investment required later. And then overhaul systems have to be completely overhauled. And there's a whole bunch of, offline and online risks as well that become problematic. I think you're right. I mean, I think this is when you can't keep up with the decentralized decision making, how do you move? That makes leadership even more important. It's more critical, more
Yeah,
central.
I mean, yeah, you make 2 good points there. The first I'll touch on is the idea that you can take care of that bad knee starting at 30, or
Yeah.
you can wind up having to have 2 knee replacements at 50 and 70 because you
Yeah.
didn't take care of it. And
Yeah.
that's the unfortunate thing is that sort of prior planning is it's not sexy, right? Like, "Oh, yeah, we
Yeah.
should," like, I'm gonna get a good night's sleep and, get up early and go to the gym every morning." I think, it's a great lifestyle. I like it myself, but it's hard to introduce to something that's been doing it differently for a long, long time.
Well,
You
and
all
yeah,
Good.
spot on. No, I mean, to your point, the accretive nature of the behavior changing in that context doesn't have to be massive. Like if I'm pounding on my knees and creating massive strain on my knees, maybe I just tweak my workout a little bit, or I try swimming a couple days a week, right? So I don't know that there's a wholesale. I don't think that this adaptive challenge requires wholesale transformation. I do think it requires the committed effort of a handful of folks that know how to lead and can integrate decentralized decision making to create relationships and stakeholders to understand the critical risks confronting companies, and that can spell that out in really productive ways. Yeah,
I
it's
don't know if
almost
it's
like
exact Go ahead, sorry.
no, I was
Oh,
going
no,
to say about a narrative. Like some of the work of leadership is creating narratives that get people behind your issue, that help you focus on the issue, right?
you don't have to tell me about the value of storytelling, so, yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
You say decentralized, and I think we talked just a moment ago about AI, and in my mind, I'm imagining a situation where you might have an internal AI that has the capacity to know what the board or the C-suite would do in any situation
Yep.
99 out of 100 times, and
Yep.
so employees well down the sort of power structure can get that feedback without having to get time in the CEO's office, or which generally doesn't happen for company employees at big companies and that sort of thing. But this idea that that power exists to have that knowledge spread throughout and readily available all the time is as we touched on AI earlier, it just struck me as you were talking then that that's another idea is that you've got this agency that can be infused into the staff where they feel like a closer connection to the mindset and the vision of the leaders, which is sometimes a real barrier for companies to understand the story of why we're here and what's the purpose of this job other than, my paycheck and my mortgage.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well,
Um,
you're gonna get me sounding like an acolyte of von Mises, a classic, free market economist, over 100 years ago, but I mean, right? Accurate information close to the source creates better decision making, and so, I mean, I think, this is why that article, maybe you saw it, went viral by, Connor, Boyack, I think is his name. It was called "AI Isn't Coming for Your Future, Fear Is." He talks about the real upside of this, and I think that exists on the CISO and cyber side as well, which is to
yeah.
say the upside is in potentially the creation of new and improved solutions and approaches to actually engaging these critical issues. So maybe we're going to see some upsides and new jobs. Yeah.
I agree with you. In fact, I've said to a few people now, I think that in the next 20 years, 5 of the top 25 CEOs are gonna
Yeah.
be people who came through the CISO path. A, because 'cause
Yeah.
they're gonna have learned their stripes, but they also have a mindset that's vital for this moment in business with regard to the digital sort of world and everything like that,
Fascinating.
because it is. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, they're not isolated to it. I agree with you that I think anyone that has to confront these issues and does so well, they're going to be in prime pole position to be, the future leaders of companies and organizations worldwide, frankly,
yeah,
because
yeah,
the pressures are high, the pressures are real. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So we've been talking a little over an hour, and as promised, we didn't get to quite everything, but before we move on to the very end, is there anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up or anything we did that you'd like to say any, final thoughts about?
Gosh, I just think that the nature of this work has to extend, and maybe this is a recap, but for any CISO out there, or frankly anyone assessing risk, it has to extend beyond actuarial data. We have to think deeply about behavioral response, and frankly the components of leadership that really galvanize folks to making progress on these critical issues. If we can't do that, then we're not going to be very effective.
No,
So yeah,
No, well, I
go ahead.
was gonna say, I think that I agree with you there, and I think that whether or not I'm being optimistic about this, I'll leave for others to decide. But this idea that we've got a moment where we've got, a pushback on social media and phones for kids too young and phones in schools, even now Harvard's talking about banning laptops because the multi-screen environment distracts with learning, and there's now science to back that idea up. That there is, combine that with what we've been talking about, and there is sort of oh, okay, wait a minute, broadly from a personal point of view, we all spend too much time on our screens, to the corporate point of view, we rely too much on technology, but we can't. So, what do we do about being resilient when that technology lets us down? To put it very broadly, whether it's a technical problem or malicious act, that idea that there is, you know, a, a moment that I hope that there is this sort of revelation that, okay, we kind of got to come up with a better way of doing it. That we have to adapt again to for the
Yeah.
word of the day. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I agreed, Martin, and I think that's pretty dangerous. Maybe final thought for me here is that it's a little dangerous to assume that technology will be a panacea. My take is that what makes us fundamentally human at the end of the day is really what gives us our species, frankly, the greatest opportunity to succeed moving forward. And that's by and large how we've related and connected in tribes for hundreds of thousands of years. So we need to hone those skills because our organizations need it.
No, yeah, I was having a conversation the other day about the beauty of forced encounters, where you sort of,
Yeah.
you didn't plan on that, and how common they used to be. When if your car broke down once upon a time, that was it. You had to go knock on the door or
No
walk down
cell
the
phone.
street.
Yeah. Even my kids, I tell them stories and they're mystified about how I could have ever come through to who I am today.
Yeah, I know, I know. I remember
Crazy.
writing my first check. Ay, ay, ay. So, Max, I'm going to round out. We're going to close real quick. I'm going to
Sure.
ask you a couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
One piece of takeaway. Pardon me. One piece of takeaway for boards. What would it be?
Yeah. If you use cyber risk and cybersecurity as a non-technical problem, and find people that think with real leadership. Yeah.
One bit of takeaway for CISOs.
Yeah. CISOs, please, because your companies need you to do this, think beyond the technical domain of your expertise. Go to build stakeholders and alliances across all of the functions and factions within your company.
And anything for insurers.
Insurers, yeah, you're going to be needed. You already are needed. we work with a big insurance company where this is a core offering for their work. In fact, I should put you in touch with them. But they, yeah, uh, staff up, get ready because we need more of you.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, the CAGR of cyber alone is an indication that's the sentiment.
Yep, yep.
So anything else, Max?
Just what a pleasure, Martin. Love chatting with you. You're a thinker on this, and you're helping us pioneer movement forward. Thank you. Thanks for the time, and really appreciate being with you.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. I've really enjoyed the conversation too, and I suspect we could go on. We'll have to do it again, right? So
Love
that'll be
to.
for sure,
We might
right?
bore your audience. I don't know, but we could talk forever on this. So
Yeah. Well, it's a niche topic, and one of the things about it is it may be boring to you, but it's impacting your life right now. And if you're not
absolutely.
paying attention to your own personal cybersecurity and the impact with the digital lives we live has on all of us, then you're selling yourself short. So that would be my pushback there on boredom.
Well, and the boredom, I'm hoping that the way we explained some of this was not boring, but the topic, you're right, is absolutely critical, so essential. Yeah.
Well, again, Max, thank you so very much. Max Martina, president of Cambridge Leadership Associates out of, near Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
Thanks again for the time.
Thanks so much, Martin. Pleasure.
Come on, thank you. Again, I'm Martin Hinton. This is the Cyber Insurance News and Information Podcast. Thank you so very much for watching and listening. If you've got a comment or a question, you can leave it down there and I'll try and get you an answer, or we'll get an answer from Max. We've discussed a few things today, and there'll be some links and that sort of thing in the show notes to find Max and to find Cambridge. But again, if you don't see what you're looking for, let us know. We're easy to find. Again, Martin Hinton, the Cyber Insurance News and Information Podcast. Thanks again for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.